Welcome to the Mind Takeaway podcast. Today we are excited to have another conversation with Jennie Stevens, climate justice scholar and activist. Jennie, you're the author of the books Climate Justice and the University and Diversifying Power. You're a professor of climate justice and a feminist, and thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome.
Great to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
So the last time we spoke was, I think, 2021 or 2022. And then we spoke about diversifying power and the importance of diversity in political and corporate spheres, and in order to make systemic and meaningful changes for everyone. I believe this new book is a continuation of that conversation, and it's focused on making changes at a university level. So then you were Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy at Northeastern University. And now you're in Ireland, Professor of Climate Justice at Maynooth University, if I pronounce this correctly. So first, thank you for being with us today. I know that you're probably even more busy than usual because the book is just out and everything that goes with promotion. So the first question I would like to ask is about that move from the USA to Europe, and how did that come about, if that's okay?
Yeah, so thank you so much. I've just moved, as you mentioned, from Boston in the United States, where I've been in U.S. higher education for more than 30 years. And I moved actually back to Dublin, Ireland. I was born in Ireland, and my family moved to the United States in the 1980s. And I had most of my education. I was 8 years old when I moved. So I always had strong connections with Ireland. And it was, multiple factors. Often with moves, it's both some personal and professional. My kids are now grown up in their 20s, so I have some more freedom to do things. But I think, the ideas in the book also motivated the move, because I increasingly, after working on climate and energy issues in U.S. higher education institutions, I became quite critical and frustrated with the lack of transformative action. There's quite a lot of patting ourselves on the back and saying we're doing good stuff, but not there's a bit of complacency, I think. And given that the climate crisis and disruptions of all kinds are getting more and more frequent and intense, it's not a time for small incremental changes anymore. We really need bigger, transformative, structural and systemic change. And that's really not what most higher education structures and incentives are promoting. So the move to Ireland is related to that, in terms of being in a place where there's more openness to bigger conversations about the state of the world and what can be done about it, and not quite as financialized. And I think that's one of the things that came up for me quite a bit, is that higher education has become so kind of corporatized, and private sector interests, big multinational companies are partnering with universities to really kind of keep things kind of status quo in a way, really kind of resisting bigger thinking about bigger changes. So there is a freedom in terms of academic work that I'm doing that I find here. I'm having very different conversations in Europe than in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we kind of guess that might be part of it. I mean, again, just reading your book, and thank you, it's been really a great read. Like we said just before we started recording, there's so much research we do for the podcast, and obviously we try and get to the topics before we speak to you and record it. But in this book, wow, we were like, yeah, okay, that's reframed us in a different way. That's a really good way of looking at it. Or quite often in your book, there was lots of areas where, okay, we were looking at it in the wrong way, or it wasn't really impactful enough to be able to be anything that could really move the needle, so to speak. Like you said, there's a lot of talk and quite often not enough deep action, especially at a community-based level, right? So your book talks about, or introduces the idea of climate justice universities. Maybe we could start there, if that's okay.
Yeah. So the concept of climate justice universities is kind of an imaginary university, right? It's thinking about what if higher education institutions, which I think are actually more powerful and more central to society than we think. We often think of universities as, places to go get some credentials for your job, and obviously there's research going on, but we don't think of universities as necessarily like really critical social infrastructure in discourse and policy and how we think about our place in society. So first of all, the idea is that acknowledging that higher education is really important, right? Like what goes on and what doesn't go on in our universities it really is influential and impactful to policy and politics and society and culture in so many ways. But climate justice universities is kind of taking this. Climate justice for me is a paradigm shift. It's not thinking about climate in the traditional ways we have with greenhouse gas emission reductions and the carbon footprint and that kind of thing. I mean, that's a part of it, but it's much more thinking about the climate crisis as a symptom of a bigger systemic structural challenge that we have in how our social and political and economic systems are perpetuating and kind of concentrating wealth and power. So what I tried to do in the book is leave the critique, the negative parts of, what's going on in universities just to chapter 2. And kind of the rest of the book is really trying to open up our imagination about what we could be doing. What if our universities were really well publicly funded so that they weren't captured by private interests and wealthy donors and corporate multinational companies? And what if they instead were, dedicated to creating and imagining and working toward a better future for everyone, more healthy, more stable, more equitable? And that's kind of the way I tried to frame the discussion. So there's a lot in the book that people would say, oh, that will never happen, or, and what I tried to do also is say, the book isn't a how-to guide, right, of what to do in universities. There are no current universities that I would call climate justice universities, right? Like this, it's an imaginary, and it's trying to, and I think we don't have enough of that in our universities, right? It's about rigid knowledge frameworks. We have to learn this. We have to learn this. But like we're in such a disruptive time. I think we really need to break some of that traditional, conventional, narrow ways of thinking and think more creatively about the future.
I was going to say that actually. It sounds to us that universities and just humanity in general sometimes there's a lack of curiosity, right? And it's this reimagining, what if we could create a better way and, things better for society, better for our communities. Maybe we could start with something I was really curious about in your book was radical acts of resistance. Can you just give us an example of one of those?
Sure. So I think within the book, I talk about kind of resist, reclaim, and restructure, trying to like thinking about getting to climate justice universities, a different way of thinking about higher education. And in terms of the resistance part, in these complicated institutions and infrastructures that we're all part of, you can't be always resisting everything, right? Because then you wouldn't fit within the institution. So, but the idea of radical acts of resistance are to recognize when there are opportunities to actually say, no, this isn't, what I want to be doing. This isn't the way. This doesn't align with what I think universities should be doing. So, I think some examples of that are, resisting what I call, and others have written about, academic capture, which is, for example, with the climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry has been strategically investing in higher education for decades to promote fossil fuel friendly technologies, policies, and to kind of normalize, of course, we all need fossil fuels. There's no way to move away from them because, look, we are all using them and this kind of thing. And so one act of resistance that I've tried to do is not take money or be on projects that have fossil fuel interests involved with. But it's difficult because a lot of universities have fossil fuel executives on their board, or they fund student scholarships, which are all things which the university is incentivized to accept and promote. And so there's no absolutes, I think, in terms of how, especially for people within higher education institutions, to resist. But there are opportunities, I think, and different people in different times in their career. Students try to hold their universities accountable with protests, and faculty and staff and other higher education leaders choose other ways, and mechanisms of when to kind of take a stance and try to resist something that's happening. So it's very context specific in terms of how and when people have an opportunity to resist. But I think we're at a time where if we don't acknowledge that there needs to be some resistance, we are just perpetuating and exacerbating the problems, and we're not holding ourselves accountable. And I think accountability and open inquiry about why we're doing this, how much funding are we getting from here or there, or what influence are those actors having on our priorities in the institution or in the sector. I think it's really important to be asking these questions, but it's not always easy because, there's powerful interests who don't want us to ask some of these questions.
Always. Sorry, but you can...
No, I just also think that, these questions are also uncomfortable to think about, because when you start thinking about it and what was maybe your role in the past, professors or people that work in universities or even students, why do we say to things that instinctively there is an answer no to, and those could be uncomfortable things to think about and answer for. I guess quite similar to when we were talking about diversity, we got more comfortable talking about it. And so I think if we can approach it with less blame and more understanding of why we did what we did, it would maybe be easier to change. So yeah, I think all changes start hard, but I think, when I was reading the book, I got angry, I got frustrated, I got hopeful. So all these emotions I was going through while reading it. Yeah, I think, as I said, if that's something that you wanted to achieve with that, you definitely did, at least from my perspective.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I tried to start each chapter with kind of a personal example, right, from my own experience, which provided hopefully some more accessibility and connection, not just thinking about these ideas in kind of the abstract. And I think, the start of the book, I talk about my first job and my first in 2005, my first week of the semester at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, was the same time that Hurricane Katrina. And I, that experience, being in an academic institution where we were very committed, I was in a department called International Development, Community and Environment, and we were all very committed to changing the systems and our literally during that time in 2005, my own sense, maybe I was naive, was that this is so horrific that this will be transformative, and we will not allow this kind of racialized suffering. And it wasn't just the response. It wasn't just the devastation of the hurricane, but the response to the devastation just further exacerbated inequities and disparities, because well-off households and families in New Orleans area and the whole Gulf were able to recover and have insurance and this kind of thing, whereas the most vulnerable and marginalized people and families and households were many of them left and became ill or sick or died, and it was just horrific. And so during that time, I was thought that universities would have a bigger impact. And here we are, almost 20 years later, And we've almost become, accustomed to seeing horrific scenes of suffering and devastation. And that we know that this is going to continue and it's going to continue to get worse, but we aren't really oriented toward big change to minimize that. And so that's kind of part of the bringing in my own personal emotional responses to things I tried to bring into the book. So as you said, it's not a traditional academic research book. It's an integration of a lot of different things, including some personal stories and examples from different colleagues and friends and people that I know.
Mm. What is one of the things that when I was reading it, I've noticed, I wouldn't say words, but okay, I noticed words, but there were things that you were mentioning that really correlate to what we are doing in leadership development. And so there is reflection, there is unlearning, there is experiential learning, learning on one's own experience, learning on an experience in others through your emotions and through your past experiences of what you want in the future. And so I was wondering, what would the leaders need to focus on in their own development for the future?
Yeah, so I think this emotional knowledge and relational knowledge is a big thing. So in higher education and most academic disciplines, there's kind of this narrow frameworks that are set up. If you're a sociologist, you study this. If you're a biologist, you study this. And one of the things that's really been lost in higher education with this structure that's, centuries old is relational knowledge, how we're all interconnected with each other, not just other, human networks, social networks, but also how we're interconnected. Humanity's survival is connected to the health of our ecosystems and the ecology and the earth systems. And by, kind of creating this disconnection that we're somehow separate from nature, it has really been to the detriment, right? Because so many people go to university, study about all kinds of important things, but they leave, and live their lives in this kind of framework that's so focused on human beings and our individual actions, and not with this networked relational knowledge and that is so fundamental. And so I think that's one of the things that I think leaders and leaders at all different levels, right, including student leaders and others, can bring in to their whatever role and work they do, and I think that comes with part of the resistance, because the kind of more narrow way of thinking about things is so ingrained and so deep that it can be uncomfortable, right, to bring up. And this is where Indigenous knowledge, like a whole, such an important whole range of knowledge framework in Indigenous cultures are all about reciprocity and those relational knowledge that in so many higher education programs has really been lost. So I think that is one thing that I think is kind of fundamental, that speaks to both, interpersonal connections with people, but also acknowledging that we're all part of these larger systems that have to, and when our ecological systems are in decline, we are also in decline, right? The mental health crises that is so prevalent throughout the world, and we can't expect our humans to be healthy when the ecology that we rely on is in such negative, devastating, and getting worse in so many ways. So again, this is the kind of also the justification for like a transformative lens. Like we have to actually people have been working on transformative thinking for a long time, but we need to mainstream it, right? And bring it to the fore. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing, and you mentioned it in your book, and we've seen this ourselves firsthand when we've worked with institutions. It's not just universities, because we work in the corporate structures as well. It's challenging everywhere. But this disconnection between even themselves and nature, and a lack of well-being at a systemic level. And what you were saying in the book, right, that it's in universities, people are getting more pressure, they're becoming more busier, and there's more financial incentives, but not for individuals as employees, because tell me if I'm wrong, but in terms of what, they get back in terms of their wages, remuneration, it's not that great compared to the massive dividends that these now universities have become corporate structures, right? So with that extra pressure, and I've worked in the corporate world for, good than 20 years or so before we had a company. So I understand that pressure. And when a university, when an institution becomes more like a company that's looking for growth's sake, and it's growing bigger, and it's like, as you mentioned in the book, there's land grabbing going on, and there's all of these other things. But when it becomes that kind of animal, surely well-being and people's mental health, and that seems to be lacking, right? And that's why in academia, we see burnout as being prevalent now. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you mentioned kind of the precarious workers and more short-term contracts, and people, their compensation isn't even that, sufficient oftentimes. And people are often, and again, this kind of financialization and a lack of kind of public support and kind of standards for well-being within has led to, as you mentioned, all these pressures that really takes a toll on the intellectual work that's able to be done, and the uncomfortable work of challenging the systems. Right, when people are barely making it, it's easier to just teach the same thing I taught last year with minimal kind of additional updating or whatever, and it really does have an impact on what ideas are promoted. And I had an experience before in the United States before I moved, where I during the student protests that were happening on campuses throughout the United States, or throughout in other places as well, last spring, a senior administrator came over to some faculty who were supporting the students in their protest, and said to the faculty, "You seem to have forgotten where your paycheck comes from," because they didn't want faculty supporting or encouraging student protest. And it in some ways it was quite shocking to have someone say that to faculty at a university, but in other ways it's kind of consistent with this attempt to kind of control and silence and kind of keep everything's fine here. We're not going to get into controversial issues. We're not going to get uncomfortable. Yeah. We're not going to, and part of that is concern about donors, right? That want to have, and parents who are paying, in the United States, higher education is so expensive. So there's families paying $80,000-$90,000 a year for their student to go to private university. So, you don't want to displease the families either, right? And so there's this, it really has an impact on what kind of conversations people can have on campus.
It totally gets in the way, right? Because if you can't stand behind the cause that you believe in because of the position that you hold, then that's when the wheels come off, right? Because then there's no impact, because people can't have any impact. You can't be an activist. And I think even the word, the label activism, it seems to carry negative connotations in many circles, especially in the world of business. Oh, you're an activist, so you're crazy, or you're destructive and the like. And that's what you're pointing to. It's to get more curious about, is there another way? Activism isn't a negative thing. But again, you can't be an activist, you can't be an activist about everything. You need to be a bit more mindful and self-aware and have clarity around what you stand behind and why, and the impacts. Because there will be consequences for all of your actions. But again, it's like, is it worth it, even though you're fearful, for example? Is it worth taking action? Because it's something that I cannot not talk about. And maybe that brings us into, I don't know if we can talk about this with you, but you mentioned in the book, for example, when you were at Harvard, that you had a really terrible experience that when I read it, I was like, well, okay, where it was pretty much sexual violence. And we've heard this across many different countries and universities that, let's be honest, white, male, it's very patriarchal. And in these power structures, these kind of things happen on a daily basis on campus. But no one really wants to talk about it, especially white men like myself, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I think it's in chapter 2, the story that I told to kind of illustrate some of the very traditional hierarchical, patriarchal structures was a sexual harassment experience that I had with a senior professor at Harvard when I was a postdoc there. And it was very traumatic. And it, the university basically wants to similarly kind of protect the reputation of the university as their number one, right? I mean, obviously they want to make sure, prevent these kinds of things from happening. But in thinking about reputation and institutional reputation, I guess, as so prevalent, these stories don't get told, right? And many people think, oh, that's like old, that's from the 70s, 80s. That doesn't happen anymore in universities, right? Because we made so much progress. And of course, we have made progress, but there's still these structural issues that allow and encourage and things to be perpetuated that you wouldn't think would still be happening. So I think that also speaks to these ideas of really opening up and moving away from some of the traditional hierarchical ways of learning, sage on the stage kind of professors that can't say anything wrong and you can't challenge them and this kind of thing, and moving to more acknowledging that everyone has things to offer, right? And we can do learning more in a collective and more community engaged, right? And doesn't have to be, universities don't have to continue to have this very hierarchical structure, because it really, in many ways isn't serving us well, because we don't end up focusing on the urgent needs of humanity, right? In many ways. So I kind of connect the personal experiences and these kind of very detailed things of what actually happens in universities with these bigger ideas about how the universities are even oriented toward kind of serving the public good and creating and imagining better futures. So they are related. Yeah.
There's a huge responsibility with a title that comes with a title for individuals, for professors, as well as the institutions, and I think that isn't taken as seriously as it is. I come from medical background, from medical industry, that I do call industry because it is, and that's why I'm not there anymore. But the it's same like having a white coat, whatever doctor said, that is true, and they're always right. And so I think talking about it in a way that you're talking about, sharing these examples, real examples, is bringing more light into, just because it was always done that way, it doesn't mean it's right. And just because we have the title doesn't mean that we're right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's why, that responsibility, as I kind of progressed in my own career and became full professor, where you don't no longer have to be, prove yourself, I guess, like there is this whole moving up the ladder. But then you realize how much responsibility and power and privilege, right, that comes with that, and recognizing that so many things that are going on are not necessarily, as you said, not necessarily recognizing both the responsibility and the potential for impact and having kind of more of a transformative impact. So, and I think that also relates to, you were mentioning kind of scholar activism, and who decides and when do we decide to be kind of activists. And one of the things that I think is really important is, especially for, scientists and there's this, and other academics and business people as well, like people kind of think of, that there's somehow we can be neutral, right? Like, oh, we're just doing the science. We're just saying what we found. We're not going to talk about what it means, or, there is this culture of to not get involved in the implications. But one of the things that I think is becoming more and more apparent to many of us is that there is no neutrality, right? Like if you do the science and you come up with and you publish and you say this is it, but you don't actually do that next step of saying, well, this means this, and I want to get involved in the policy advocacy, so, then you're still that's a political stance to not to get involved in the political part of it. So that is one of the things I think that from early on in my career, because I started as a scientist. My PhD was in environmental science and engineering, and I saw all of these scientists doing amazing research, but they would stick in their lane, with their scientific research, and actually get narrower and narrower rather than stepping out and getting involved in the implications of the science. And that was quite frustrating for me to see. And I didn't want to do that myself. So I kind of switched and became very interdisciplinary, doing more policy relevant work and social science connected to the physical science or the engineering and technical science. And so I think there is a myth that there is a neutral, unbiased kind of work that goes on in universities, and I don't think that is. I think everything is a stance, right? Like whether you engage, how and when you choose to engage, even if you think you don't, you just want to stick with the conventional way of doing research or teaching. That is a political position as well. So I think that's an important point that is coming up a lot. It's still, very current. These are very current issues, and hopefully the idea is with the book is really to catalyze new conversations, right, about some of these things, so people can open up a little bit and think differently, and maybe some may engage differently. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And then this neutrality is willful blindness, let's be honest. You have to take a stance at some point. You have to believe in certain things for things to change. Because for society to change things, it takes time. We know that, right? But yeah, I mean, when I read your book, I didn't think that it was impossible to change. But then I guess the kind of work that we're in, we're kind of looking to change things ourselves. So maybe it's not too big a leap. But again, curiosity comes to mind, courage. There's a massive lack of curiosity across the board. Let's be curious about, okay, if I've done this narrow research, how could I open it up to other communities? Where could it actually have some value outside of academia, right? And maybe this is a good segue into, let's talk about technologies, for example. So innovation. And you mentioned the term Exnovation that I wasn't, or both of us, we weren't really, we'd never really heard that before. So we were fascinated by that. Maybe you could unpack that for us.
Yeah. So the idea with Exnovation is to actually focus on how to stop doing things, whether it be technologies or practices or policies or structures that we know are no longer serving us well, right? We focus so much on innovation in business, in organizations, in universities. Everybody wants innovation, and innovation is all about developing new ways of doing things, new technologies, new ideas, and the assumption with innovation is that the new will displace the old, right? We'll just naturally kind of stop doing obsolescence. The old way of doing things will go away. But what we're seeing over and over in so many examples in different sectors is we develop the new, we have these new ideas, and they don't necessarily lead to exnovation, right? Innovation and exnovation should be kind of yin yang, like you need both. But often, in the climate energy space, we see all this innovation with renewable energy, and renewable energy has gone up around the world. A lot of places are using renewable energy, and the assumption is it will displace fossil fuels. But fossil fuel extraction and exploitation has also gone up, and the fossil fuel companies are making record profits, more than they've ever done before. The United States is the biggest oil and gas producer right now in the world, and it's actually fossil fuels is going up. And so the idea with climate change and with climate research is that we should have and could have been doing fossil fuel phase out exnovation research. How can we globally phase out fossil fuels? And we aren't doing that research. Like, it's not really a major topic in any climate, energy, academic research space because of the funding and because of the fossil fuel industry, really trying to, for decades, ensure that we are continuing to extract and exploit fossil fuels. But there are lots of other examples as well. Like if you think about plastic, we know now that microplastics are in our bloodstream. They're in the breast milk that babies are drinking. There's all kinds of negative health impacts of that. Yet we don't have a major societal effort to exnovate away from using plastics. I mean, of course, people are coming up with, we can substitute this and here in this application. But there isn't a coordinated structural effort to move away from plastics. And so that's where this idea of exnovation comes in. And it's not a word, I didn't make up that word. It is a word that is, others have used it, but it's not widely, when I've given talks about, book talks, that's often a word that people are really interested in. And it is a powerful way of thinking about what we need to do because obviously, the simplicity movement, and there's lots of ways people talking about consumption reduction, and there are lots of ideas that are in line with exnovation, but thinking of it in terms of the research agenda or our priorities, it really hasn't yet been widespread or mainstreamed. Yeah.
I've noticed that, dipping my toe in academia because we're not from that, right? But even, collaborating on some research and co-authoring a book with a university, it was an eye-opener because there's so many things that need to be changed that are outdated, that are still being taught to students. But is this because of people's tenure and their egos and that power structure? Because there's clearly things that are decades old, but they're still taught in higher education. And it's really, it's kind of shocking to me, at least. I don't know what Mira thinks about this, but it's so old. Why are we still talking about that? Because that's causing quite a lot of damage. And we're bringing, new generations into the fold based on really rocky foundations where, that information's just simply not true, or it's completely been disproved, with meta studies. I mean, we noticed it in psychology and neuroscience, it's prevalent, but is that across the board? I'm guessing it's everywhere, right?
Yeah. And this is where the chapter on teaching, what are universities teaching our students? I really focus in on that idea of unlearning, and that gets to the point that you just made, that there are these knowledge frameworks, these kind of things that are thought of like the canon of the old school way of learning about economics or psychology or sociology or whatever. And it's just kind of thought of in many disciplines as foundational, so we just have to keep with it. But particularly economics, and economics is a big one, obviously, it has such impact on policy and institutions and organizations. And, the neoliberal market-based economic structure is taught as if this is the only way, when in fact, there's a diversity of economic theories, right? There's feminist economics, there's well-being economics, there's ecological economics, there's all kinds of ways of thinking about economics that integrates the planetary boundaries, the connection that humans have with the rest of Earth systems, but it isn't in the mainstream, right? So as you said, we're teaching so many students, and they're graduating in credentialed programs that are almost, dishonest because it's not the reality of some of these narrow ways of and traditional ways of thinking. So I think this is again where hopefully there's space to open up some of these. But the problem, as you said, there is quite a lot of defensiveness, right? Because the way the system is structured is that people learn this way, and it's kind of like a mentorship. Who gets to be a professor? The people who've studied under others who are professors, and then they get kind of reinforced kind of specific ways of thinking, and often aren't very open to thinking differently. So I think that's also one of the goals of the book, is to encourage, again, an openness so people can be humble in their, and be ready and try to encourage people to be open to thinking in new ways, because the world is changing so fast, right? And our academic curriculum, I don't think, is changing on, in the same scale. So clearly we need to open up some space for thinking and learning and unlearning some of the ways that are really not helpful anymore.
One of the things that because I'm concerned about our time, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we could go for another hour longer. But one of the things that we were talking about before as well with other guests that I can think about, Camilla, when we were talking about AI ethics, is that there is a change with feminism. So the more women and female energy comes into play, that we are actually changing what is happening. So feminism is changing patriarchal structures. And I remember that conversation with Camilla as well. She was talking about the leaders in AI ethics are women. And so, now I get goosebumps. So, and you mentioning it in your book and how important it is. So, if you could just touch briefly on that, I really appreciate it.
So I think one of the things, particularly in my field of climate and energy, it's been very male dominated and technocratic, right? Like technological solutions. And this is what the fossil fuel industry also wants us to focus on: carbon capture and storage, carbon removal technologies, solar geoengineering, which is this idea of injecting sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere to cool the Earth. Which are kind of crazy, scary ideas. Yet, in many of our leading universities, these are the ideas that are being funded some by billionaires and philanthropists, some by corporations. And it has this kind of masculine, we can control it kind of thing, right? Which is a narrow way of thinking about it. And when we think about the relational knowledge of how the Earth systems work and how we are, that is a more feminist perspective, right? And so I think the climate justice lens that I bring and that I try to talk about, what if climate justice as a principle, as a set of principles, was foundational to our universities, which would be a more relational, feminist, structural, systemic way of thinking about things, not narrow, linear kind of controlling way of thinking about things. What if that was at the core? And it's not, I also try to sometimes think about feminism as an invitation for all of us to think differently. It's not necessarily men versus women. Obviously, there are gender differences, but there's, spectrum of people in thinking on and working on all of these different ways of thinking. So, but I do think it's really important, and that connects for myself. My 2020 book on diversifying power, why we need anti-racist feminist leadership on climate and energy. That's, again, from my own experience working with so many people in the space who are just thinking technocratically, right? And they weren't thinking about these broader connections and bigger systemic transformative change, which again I associate with a more feminist lens and feminist perspective. And as we've discussed as well, that was also acknowledging power, right, and power structures, and that's kind of what, for me, feminism is kind of acknowledging these systemic structural issues of power that reinforce certain things and end up excluding others, and we need to bring those back in. Yeah.
I want to talk about the exclusion part as well, because we've talked about it in Indigenous, I can't even speak, put my teeth back in, Indigenous society, right? That there's so many people in the global south that have no say. And I looked at the last COP, it was a bit of a joke, let's be honest, because there's so much, again, there's a blind kind of reliance on technology. It's going to save us. So we pump all the money into carbon capture. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't look at that and research it, but what about social impact? And what about all of this indigenous knowledge that we're just ignoring? Because as you said before, humans have this weird kind of way of forgetting and isolating themselves that we're part of the system. People say we're going to destroy the planet, but it sounds very separate. We're part of this ecosystem because we're biological living creatures as well, and we forget that quite often. And that's what's getting in the way, right? That these solutions are great for research, but what about looking at all of these diverse perspectives? And again, I understand, not to genderize it, but feminism, of course, if there was more females in senior leadership positions, we wouldn't have the mess we're in, that's for sure. And I can say that as a white privileged male, just because when I see that there's more diversity in the structures that we work with, it's much easier to impact change. There is more activism and there's more things having more impact. That's just what I see,
Yeah. And you mentioned the global south. And I think this is also where climate justice lens brings in our global interconnections, right? And how the colonial legacy of that has separated and concentrated wealth in certain parts of the world and extracted and exploited wealth and resources and also human workforce in other parts of the world is perpetuating many of the problems, both with the climate, but also social and economic injustices. And I think from a climate justice perspective, that's kind of what it's all about, is kind of acknowledging that the traditional technocratic masculine way of thinking about climate change as a technocratic problem that we need technological solutions really is perpetuating climate coloniality, which is like continuing to extract from the South, and so that people in the northern, richer parts of the world or even within countries, right, can feel, oh, I'm doing what I can do for the climate, so I'm okay. But without acknowledging these bigger structural and really colonial legacy of exploitation, we are just going to continue to exacerbate these injustices. So that's what the climate justice lens is also all about, is bringing this a global perspective and a very human rights based perspective. Everybody deserves a stable climate and well-being, what's needed for healthy life. And yet we're so far from that, right? Yeah. And so much of what's happening is actually just making the inequities and the concentration of wealth and power. Billionaires are just controlling the world more and more, and that's really not working well for anybody, including the billionaires.
Well, you just mentioned solar geoengineering, which is, It's fascinating, but it scares the life out of me because, again, it's clear from even cloud seeding, we can see the damage that it does that no one reports on, right? Because they don't talk about that, again, rich, powerful nations or individual billionaires who have, too much power, they can use that to actually cause more problems for communities, as you say. So when there's a massive problem where it could be a hurricane or there's massive devastation, it's always the poorest fringe communities that end up being even poorer or losing even more, because as you say, if you're from privilege, then you have the money to pick yourself back up. You probably will have insurance. But again, if you're not, if you're already on the poverty line when this thing kicked in, then it's obviously going to make it worse. So some of these technologies, no one is researching the damage it does in another country if a rich, powerful country is benefiting from it at the time when they implement said technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Solar geoengineering is a scary one. And I've written quite a lot about it. And I'm one of the kind of academic voices really kind of challenging that, but it's becoming more and more mainstreamed, and more public funding is also going towards solar geoengineering. And I think it's dangerous. So yeah, I talk about that in the chapter about research in universities, about what we could, as an example of something that is being supported and endorsed and becoming more mainstream because of how the universities are engaging on these issues, when we could be doing so much more in some other spaces as well. So some of these technologies are really also a distraction, from bigger ways of thinking and structural transformative change.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how we need to also change the perspective of what success is, how much we need, and why. Is it just because the marketing has taught us this in the past 50 years after the Second World War, that we need to grow exponentially all the time? How far? And so it is interesting. I think the questions that you pose and solutions that you suggest are really good food for thought, and I really thank you for it.
Yeah, and we would recommend everyone for listening to read your book, because it's not, as you said, it's not just an academic book, right? It's hopeful. I don't know what other people will read into it, but I at least got hopeful about it, because I'm like, what if that is possible? But again, things have to change, and who knows how long that will take. But I am hopeful, because I do believe that we can make those changes. And I don't know about you, Jenny, but we see that happening. I mean, okay, the work that we do see it. We're seeing it every day. But degrowth as a model, for example, when I talked about not having growth for growth's sake, maybe a decade ago, people shouted at me. They got so angry in the business world. You're insane. How could we run a company if we don't have growth on growth every year? And I'm saying, well, there must be another way. And now we're looking at, degrowth and donut economics. It's now becoming more mainstream. So it is possible. But it's whether companies and the corporate structures are going to be comfortable letting go of some of the reins of control. I think that's the trickiest bit.
Yeah. And we here, just in the past few months, we have launched a new organization called Climate Justice Universities Union.
I can see, yeah.
And it's a network, or more than a network, a collective, for collective action of people from all different places in different universities, and community members who are not necessarily part of specific universities, but who acknowledge and want to work toward changing the role of the universities and leveraging the power that universities have for addressing more of the existential challenges that humanity is facing, and acknowledging how they're all interconnected. And so I've definitely gotten hope, and the antidote to kind of climate anxiety is action, right? And so finding networks and ways in whatever institution or professional or personal position people are in, there's people to connect with and to work to be done in solidarity, in collective action, that really can change the way we're thinking about the world, and humanity. And, it is a dark time. There's a lot of negative things happening in the world. And at the same time, with that comes new relationships, new ways of thinking, and creative actions that we can all get involved with. So, thank you so much for reading the book and your insightful reflections on it, and having this conversation. It's really been great. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for talking to us again. This has been a second time we meet, and we hope we'll meet again soon in the future again with something new, interesting.
Yeah, in the future where things have actually shifted in a more impactful and positive way, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Great.